Okay, so the purpose of today's lesson is going to basically continue our conversation from Tuesday. We did not get through all of our information that I had planned on Tuesday. There was also some pieces about Tuesday that you seem to have been a little bit confused on, so I wanted to make sure I touched on those again, maybe explain it. I'll try and explain it a little bit differently. If you're still having trouble with it, obviously, please send me an email as soon as you can about that information, or obviously anything later on that's not included from when we talked on Tuesday. We've got 7 learning goals for today. We've got differentiate between strict and loose construction, differentiate between expressed and implied powers, describe the powers that Congress has denied, describe what the leadership roles are in the House and Senate, describe what a committee is, differentiate between the types of committees that exist, and describe how a member of Congress gets placed on a committee. So for our learning goals, the first 2 are from our previous lesson, while 3 through 7 will be new ones for us today. So let's get back to implied powers. Implied powers are, again, these are things that we do not actually see in the Constitution. They're just implied that they have them. This is a loose construction. So let's go back to loose versus strict construction. The word construction just really means interpretation. Okay. If I were to be the opposite of a loose construction, if I were a strict constructionist, if I had a strict interpretation of the Constitution, I would basically have, if you had any question about whether the government is able to do something or not, you would just simply look at the U.S. Constitution, see where it applies, and if it doesn't apply, then the answer in the eyes of a strict constructionist would be, no, the government doesn't have power to do that. And then obviously if it's found there, they would just green light it and say, yep, go ahead, no problems there. However, there are some things in here which becomes tricky too, because implied powers, because they're not directly in there, does allow for wiggle room. That's basically what they're using in the textbook to describe it, is you can take the wording of the Constitution and basically try and bend them to do things that you want to do. It doesn't necessarily say you can't do it, and it doesn't necessarily say you can do it. It just says basically like, well, you have the authority to act in this way. And then someone can go, oh, well, then that means I should be able to do this because it's for the sole purpose of upholding one of my responsibilities in the Constitution. Now, why might this clause be so important in the creation of the U.S. Constitution? For me, you have to keep in mind that not everyone knows the future. And we came up with some great examples and discussion in our last meeting. Hodges had talked about how, well, the Air Force wasn't created or wasn't mentioned in the Constitution because airplanes hadn't been invented yet. And that's true. And so imagine having to make a change to the Constitution, which isn't which is actually very difficult, certainly not as difficult as it was under the Articles of Confederation. But imagine having to create an amendment to the Constitution just to allow the Air Force. Now, logically thinking, it wouldn't be one that was difficult to do, but would it be something that you would want to really spend time and effort to have to do? And clearly the answer is no. So under the necessary and proper clause, the U.S. government would be able to use the defense of, well, one of our main responsibilities as a government is to basically protect the nation through national security. And that would be something that you could then use as your excuse for creating something like the Air Force. So let's get back into some other things too. Here are the other ones that we had talked about. You don't have to do this reflection one in your responses to me. Remember, that's how you're going to try and earn credit for today, is you just respond to the reflection portions. But because we already did this one, I don't think it's necessary for you to do this specific one. But let's kind of think of it real quick together. So the way you explained it, the Internal Revenue Service. The Internal Revenue Service was created by the U.S. government, and their main goal is to basically enforce tax laws, specifically about the income tax. And you might be wondering, where exactly is that going to come into play at? Well, there's an amendment to the U.S. Constitution that deals with the income tax. And the funny thing is you're like, well, why did they have to create an amendment for it, if that's what you're actually thinking? It's because when they originally created the income tax, because of a strict construction viewpoint, you had people challenge the U.S. government in the federal court system about the ability to do this, in which the federal government lost. So the only way that a income tax could be implemented is through an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. So we actually had a point in time where we could have actually avoided the income tax, but they ended up approving it. So the FBI, the CIA, those are all related to national defense. The Air Force, we've already discussed. The Food and Drug Administration, if you don't know what the Food and Drug Administration is, they basically put guidelines as to what is considered safe methods and practices for the creation of food and drugs. And you might be wondering, well, what power does that have to deal with? Well, that actually has to deal with the Commerce Clause, which was created in the U.S. Constitution. And one of the things that they were able to do is that allowed them to control trade between states. If we remember back to the Articles of Confederation, one of the problems is that you had states all creating their own trade laws as it relates to in between states. So what happens here is the FDA basically gets to control the rules for what happens with food and drugs as far as being their creation, because they would be traded across state lines. Okay, some express powers. Express powers would be the strict construction. These are things, again, that I can see specifically within the Constitution. Some examples are declaring war. I know the Congress has that power. I can find it within the Constitution. The same thing about coining money, laws about immigration and citizenship. Commerce Clause, that's something I just referenced just a moment ago. Financing powers, indirect tax versus direct tax. If you don't know what an indirect tax is, that's basically like taxes on specific products like your cell phone service. You would only pay a tax on those things if you actually consume them. Gasoline is another thing that has an indirect tax. And that's something that states tack on too. I believe Michigan has one of the highest taxes on gasoline in the country right now. Where a direct tax would be income taxes. Once I make the money, they directly take it. So, all right. Let's continue moving on to some other expressed powers. Bankruptcy. If you know anyone who has filed for bankruptcy, I mean, that's an unfortunate situation, but there are laws surrounding that, and it's not states that decide that, it is the federal government which decides laws about bankruptcy. Weights and measures. Basically, you're deciding on how things will be weighed and measured. So one of the things that you may have noticed, if you go to a gas station and you see a seal, it looks like a piece of like tin foil or something that's kind of looks like a sticker slapped on the gas pump. And that's kind of the government's way of making sure that gasoline stations pumps are functioning to where they're actually giving you a gallon. So like it's not the idea of like, hey, my version of a gallon is different than your version of gallon. Same thing with other aspects too. Congressional elections, time and place are established, so Congress can say when those elections will be held. However, it's up to the states to determine how those elections will be carried out. Okay, powers denied. So we've talked about powers that the Congress has, and clearly we're not able to touch on all of them in this short video, so I only selected a few of them. But writ of habeas corpus, basically it's talking about how you can't be held in secret and must be brought before a court to charge you with a crime. Those are things that would be reflective of the time that the United States was created in. In Europe, this was something that could happen pretty easily, where they would just basically take you and throw you in a dungeon, or maybe not like a dungeon, like old school dungeon, but like throw you in a prison cell, and then you would never be brought before the court for a trial. Basically, that would happen to a lot that would be referred to as political prisoners. The one thing that is talked about in your textbook is that writ of habeas corpus is not applicable in cases of rebellion. I'm not exactly sure how that goes. Keep in mind, we haven't really had a rebellion since 1860s or so, when we had the Civil War. You have bill of attainder. You cannot punish someone without a trial. So that would be like, oh, yep, hey, you know what? We sentenced you to be guilty, and here's your punishment. So you have to be able to basically face a jury of your peers or go through the trial itself. Big one here, ex post facto laws. Ex post facto simply means after the fact. So, for instance, you cannot punish someone for an act that they committed before it was against the law. So, for example, let's think of it this way. I'm going to just try and use something that was created recently. Laws have been created that have basically tried to ban the sale and use of flavored vaping products. Okay, So for me, that's not a big deal, but if I were a store owner and I have a history of selling those flavored vaping and tobacco products, I could possibly be in trouble if we didn't have this, because they would go, hey, you know what? We made this law, and you were found guilty, or you were being charged with having violated that law. But you have to keep in mind this: when I was doing that action, it wasn't illegal. So you can't punish me for doing things that are now illegal if during the time when I actually committed those acts, they were not illegal. Okay? So reflection: are there any powers that you can think of that should be denied to Congress? So we've talked about some already. Are there any that you can think of that you would like to add to the list? So that would be one of the first things that you go ahead and add, or respond to in your emails that you send to me. Okay? So you can pause the video and kind of think on that. I'm just going to keep moving forward. There's no point in me pausing and letting you think when you can do that on your own in a video. So we're going to move into leadership positions. What are they? How do I get there? And what do they do? Here are your leadership positions within the U.S. Congress right now. On the left, we have Speaker Nancy Pelosi. She's the Speaker of the House, and essentially she is the leader of the Speaker of the House. The leader of the Speaker of the House is normally always from the majority party. So because the Democrats have more seats than the Republicans in the in Congress, in the House of Representatives, a Democrat will take the place of Speaker of the House. The interesting note is, and this actually came to my surprise. I didn't know this until a few years ago. I just figured that you had to be a member of the House of Representatives. You actually don't have to be a member of the House of Representatives to be the Speaker of the House. And that came about when John Boehner, a representative out of Cincinnati, Ohio, decided to resign in the middle of his term, and he was also the Speaker of the House, so he had to be replaced. And I was listening to a talk radio show, and they had someone on. His name was Newt Gingrich, and he was actually Speaker of the House in the 90s when Bill Clinton was president. And he had talked about how people are asking him to become Speaker of the House, and it kind of struck me. I'm like, well, Newt's been out of politics for, over a decade. How is he going to be in there? And that's how I learned that you don't actually have to be a member of the House of Representatives to become Speaker of the House. However, I can't recall a time in history, not saying it didn't happen, where a member of the House of Representatives was not used as Speaker of the House. The House Majority Leader or Floor Leader is, I don't even know how to say his first name. We'll just call him Stoyer. And basically he acts as the first assistant to the Speaker of the House. Basically what happens is Nancy is going to go ahead and get all her Democrats to fall in line with whatever it is she wants to do. She's the leadership. Does that always happen? No, it doesn't. There are 4 particular people who are causing a lot of trouble in in today's times for Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi within her own party. That would be things like Rashida Tlaib. That would be AOC. That would be Omar, and I can never remember the 4th woman. They're referred to as the Squad. So House Minority Leader and Floor Leader is Kevin McCarthy, and basically what his job is to control the narrative and the agenda for the House of Representative members who are all Republican right now. And basically he is going to say, this is our goals, this is what we're trying to do. Now keep in mind, the power that he has is somewhat limited because he's in the minority. Democrats will always be able to outvote him in the Republican Party should they always decide to vote along party lines. Other leadership positions, on the right we have Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, and we have Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer. And basically what happens in this case is Majority Leader Mitch McConnell will essentially serve the role in the Senate that Nancy Pelosi does inside of the House. And the same thing for Chuck Schumer. Chuck Schumer will essentially serve the same role in the Senate as Kevin McCarthy does inside of the House. Because the reason why these roles are somewhat reversed is because Republicans currently control the Senate, while the Democrats are the minority party within the Senate. Of course, all those things can change in approximately 6 months when we have a new election. Okay, there are some other positions too, and I always laugh at the name, and they're referred to as whips. And so we have Dick Durbin and John Thune, who are whips in the Senate, and then we have Steve Scalise and James Clyburn, who are whips in the House of Representatives. In case you didn't know, Steve Scalise was actually shot in a it was a congressional softball game. A guy who was clearly having some issues decided to bring a gun out to a scrimmage between congressional members and just decided to shoot people. But anyways, and what whips do is they kind of act as assistants to the leaders in the House and the Senate, and they whip up the support amongst their fellow party members and basically check in with those party members to determine whether they're falling in line and going along with the message and the direction that the leadership wants. Now, the one thing that I want to make sure that you understand is it sounds like what happens is that Republicans just simply follow Republicans, whatever leadership says you do. And the same thing for Democrats. And for the most part, that probably is the case. However, that is not always the case. Just because you belong to a party does not mean that you can't cross party lines and vote with the other ones. It's just become a case in modern times, unfortunately, where we see that in almost nearly all cases, we just see parties voting along party lines. The days of compromise seem to be at a standstill right now, and moving forward it doesn't. So, some reflection, what are the various leadership roles within both houses of Congress, and what are their jobs? So that will be another thing that you respond an email to me from. And so we're going to move on at this point too. And we're going to talk about committees. So think, why do none of your teachers teach every subject in school? Okay, I don't even teach every subject within social studies. Why do you think that might be? Why do you think that I don't teach math other than my pure, unadulterated, passionate hatred for mathematics? Why would I not teach math? And then let's think of it too. In social studies, why might it be better for me to concentrate on teaching just a few courses like AP European History and the Government Economics section, rather than having to concentrate on U.S. history, honors U.S. history, if honors U.S. history ever exists again. World history, honors world history. Economics, honors economics. Government, honors government. AP European history, psychology. Okay, so why would it be more beneficial for me to just kind of concentrate on a couple? Well, if you think about it, that's a lot of information to try and learn and understand and master. It's difficult enough for me to try and be the master of the few subjects that I have. It takes a lot of hard work. It's very time consuming. And so therefore, it's best for me to concentrate on a few things to get better in so that I can do my job better than if I were to have to spend my time learning everything. And we're going to apply the same logic to government. And when we do that, we're going to talk about standing committees. And standing committees are groups of people who are essentially charged with addressing certain aspects of government. Now keep in mind, there are 13 standing committees in both the Senate and the House of Representatives. And each of those committees have subcommittees. So one of the things I wanted to do here is, there are so many different committees within House of Representatives and the Senate. There's the Judiciary Committee, there's the Armed Services Committee, there's the Agricultural Committee, there's one on education, but there's 13 different ones. And keep in mind, the government is handling so many different responsibilities. It would be absolutely unreasonable to expect every House of Representative member and every senator to become an absolute expert on all of those particular things. So what we do is we break them into committees for those groups to essentially handle. And when we eventually talk about introducing bills, depending on the topic, normally those committees will be the ones who have that bill sent to them to consider first, because they're supposed to be the experts on that particular topic. Now, the subcommittees are basically more individualized versions of the committees. So an example of that would be think of Chandler Park. Oops, hold on. Okay, think of Chandler Park. Chandler Park with the Social Studies Department. Think of the Social Studies Department as being your standing committee. And then you have specialized areas within the standing committee so for us, a subcommittee would be AP European History. Clearly, I'd be on that one. government. So for the committee for government would be myself and Ms. Truex, and the same thing for economics, where the subcommittee for American history would be who teaches that? It's Monteleone and Toma, I believe. And so what would happen is anything related to the social studies department would be kicked to us as a whole, and then we would kind of delegate, like if the topic that the school wanted to make changes in was economics, so then basically Ms. Truex and I would go ahead and do the heavy lifting and digging on what we want to do regarding that topic, and then report out to our committee, and then the committee would basically give a recommendation on whether we should move forward on debating that or not with the school. That's not to say if you aren't in that committee that you never have a say in what happens, because if the bill actually gets out of the committee, then what happens is that it's open for debate amongst everyone within that house of government. So yeah, it's not as if you don't get into the committee or subcommittee that you'll never have a chance to discuss it and have your say in it. It just may be a little bit more difficult to get there. Okay? All right. Now, each committee has leadership positions, and you have to figure out how you get there too, which we'll cover right now. So members request positions on committees. Some people might pick a committee because it's near and dear to the goals that they set out when they ran for government. So like for me, I might try and get on one for education, but then I might try and get on another one too. Normally you are part of 2 different committees. And then I think there are 4 subcommittees your textbook talks about is traditionally what members belong to. Now, if there are more requests for a position than there are available seats, then what happens is you have a special caucus amongst your party members to see who's going to get that. So basically it's an election amongst the members of your party to see who's going to fill those positions. Now, leadership positions are referred to as chairs, and those are chosen by the House and Senate leaders of the majority party. Your textbook does mention that traditionally in the past it had basically gone to individuals who were the most senior member, but to try and encourage more participation and new leadership initiatives, what they've done is moved it to holding elections amongst the party to determine who's going to hold those specific committee chairs. Okay. Non-permanent committees are the last thing we're going to be talking about. So select committees used to carry out a duty that is not covered by an existing committee. Normally it's like an investigative committee. Joint committees, these are committees that are created to have members of each house work on something together. And I'd mentioned these in a previous class. This is often the case when similar bills are passed out of each House of Congress, but they're not identical. And so what ends up happening is you have to bring members of the House and the Senate together to basically hammer out the deal. So let's put it this way: if Congress had passed similar bills on education, but obviously they're not the same, they're just very similar and not exactly the same, I would probably select members from the committee that deals with education from the House and the Senate to then form a joint committee to hammer out the details of what the final bill will look like. And the thing to take note of is that they don't always succeed in producing one final document. Sometimes they're so far apart on what they want to get done that they don't actually get anything done. But that's normally when a joint committee would form, is when you have similar but slightly different bills passed from each House of Congress, and then they try and have one finalized version to then be kicked back to each House of Congress to debate, and then at that point, if they are passed, they would then go to the president for signature or veto. And that brings us to our last reflection point here. It's what's the purpose of each of the committees that were mentioned? What is the purpose of a subcommittee? And how would I be placed within a committee? And how is leadership determined? So I look forward to seeing all of these responses inside of the emails that you send me. And that's going to wrap it up for today's video lesson.